This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Vermont has a housing shortage. This is not news. We know the numbers, and they are grim. According to state data, Vermont needs to add 41,000 housing units in the next 5 years to meet demand. To get there, we need to build houses and apartments and refurbish and weatherize old units. We also need to keep having conversations about short-term rentals, which is what we're going to do today. A lot of people in our region, including many of you, rent out a house or a room as a secondary or even primary source of income. Maybe you use Airbnb, VRBO, or another site to do it. Others rent these places when you go on trips. I'm meeting up with a group of college friends this weekend, and we're all staying together in an Airbnb. It's convenient and pretty cost-effective compared to a hotel. But I also do wonder sometimes if the house I'm staying in for a fun weekend could or should be a house that a family lives in full-time. Over the past couple years, several towns in our region have passed ordinances regulating short-term rentals. Today, we're going to check in on Vermont's short-term rental market and hear about some of the newer regulations to go in place. Later in the show, we'll talk with 3 people who have been giving short-term rentals a lot of thought: the head of the Vermont Short-Term Rental Alliance, the research coordinator for the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, and a board member of the Wyndham and Windsor Housing Trust. We also invite you to weigh in, starting right now. Are you in a town or a city that regulates short-term rentals? Do you think these regulations are good for the community, or do they not go far enough? You can give us a call at 800-639-2211 or send us an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. First, we are joined by my colleague Howard-Weiss Tisman, who is in our Brattleboro studio. Howard, how's it going?
Hey, Michaela.
So you've been reporting on this vote that just went down in Londonderry about short-term rental regulations. What are the new rules that they were voting on, and what was the result of the vote?
Right. So Londonderry put a short-term rental ordinance in place just about a year ago. And the original ordinance was pretty vanilla. It just asked short-term rental owners to register. There were health and safety codes, stuff like that. It wasn't too controversial. They have to pay an annual fee to register in town. But then in the spring, the select board added some amendments to that ordinance. And there were some things that were less controversial in there about garbage pickup and trying to cut down on parties, stuff like that. But there were 2 new amendments added to the ordinance back in the spring that really caught people's attention. And they have to do with new unhosted properties. So basically homes in Londonderry that are purchased and the folks don't live there. Maybe they're purchased from folks from out of town.
So this is very different from if you're renting out a room in your house or your basement apartment. That's not what this is.
That's right. They're calling these unhosted properties. And they say that if someone buys a property, they have to wait a year before they rent it out. And they also put a limit of 50 nights on there. It's important to say that existing properties are grandfathered, so this is only for newly purchased places in town. The select board approved them in April. The folks who are pro short-term rentals gathered enough signatures to call for a special town meeting. That was held on July 19th, and the town overwhelmingly said they like the new rules. They said they want them in place. They voted 66-25 to keep the new rules, so they're in effect. They went into effect July 1st.
So I'm curious why all this came up in the first place. Have short-term rentals been a big issue in that area of southern Vermont, particularly in the resort towns that you have there?
Yeah, it is. It's not a new issue. I mean,
Right.
Second homes have long been a part of Vermont and Vermont's economy, especially in these ski towns. Londonderry is near 3 ski resorts. And there's always been this little bit of tension between folks that live there and folks that use the second homes. The second homes are such an important part of the economy. It's important to the local businesses. It's important to a lot of the folks who cut the lawn of these places, who clean these places. So they really rely on each other. And I think what's happening is this housing crisis, like you talked about, is getting so acute. People are really worried about it. And so they're seeing these rise in short-term rentals as a part of that housing problem. So people can't find places to rent. The number of Airbnbs are increasing, and that's kind of what's playing out.
Yeah. So it seems like there's sort of these two camps here. Like some residents think these changes are going to slow the growth of short-term rentals, which would in turn increase permanent housing in the area. But then others say this is going to impact the economy. I mean, we have a couple ski resorts nearby. People need a place to stay. And these Airbnbs are part of a network that is really supporting this region's economy. Is that a fair way to sum it up?
Yeah, definitely. And, what's really interesting is we're seeing this play out across the state where select board city councils are passing ordinances. And then the folks who have the short-term rentals are gathering signatures to call for a special meeting. And most of the time across the state when these meetings happen, the public is saying, we want these rules. So these votes are happening. They're holding the town meetings, and then the public comes out and they say they want stricter rules on it. So that's what's happening across the state.
And there are a number of different towns, I know you've mentioned in your reporting, Howard, that have voted to more tightly regulate short-term rentals. Stowe comes to mind. Are you finding they're usually these more tourist-focused towns?
It does seem to be. Yup, that's happening in Stowe. It's happening in West Windsor and Plymouth. All of those towns held votes, and the folks said that they want the regulations on it. I'll mention quickly that the Stowe Reporter did some really interesting reporting looking at the town data, and they found that more than 75% of the short-term rentals in town were owned by folks that didn't live in Stowe. So I think there's this perception that out-of-towners are buying up homes just to rent them. And so that's taking housing stock off, and everybody's worried about the housing crisis. So that's what's playing out.
Yeah. I mean, that number, that statistic you just shared does seem to bear that out. It might go beyond a perception at this point.
Yeah, it seems like it. And short-term rentals are very popular. I do them, as you said, you do them too. And I don't know what there's an interesting kind of, pull, give and take about whether towns can do this and whether this is legal for a town to, tell property owners what they can do with their own properties. And that's another conversation that's happening around.
Yeah, because it's happening at the town level and then at the state level as well. Is that right? There have been some conversations in the legislature about how to regulate at a statewide level.
Yeah, that's right. I'm sure Julie's going to talk about this. Something that the Short-Term Rental Alliance talks about a lot is they'd much rather see a statewide policy rather than it going from town to town. It can get ugly. There's been a lot of chatter on the Londonderry Facebook page about this. And so towns are kind of battling out, kind of making it up as they go. They pass these ordinances and then they take the next step and start putting the regulations on it. Right now in Stowe, the Stowe Select Board Planning Commission is having the same conversation, trying to consider how they can slow down the number of short-term rentals that are happening in that ski resort town.
You mentioned Julie. That's Julie Marks, the head of the Vermont Short-Term Rental Alliance, who will be joining us in just a couple minutes alongside some other guests who have been thinking hard about if and how to regulate short-term rentals in Vermont. Howard, have you seen data about how the short-term rental market has changed since the pandemic?
Yeah, and that's really what's driving a lot of this discussion. This data is pretty clear. I think it's you can't argue too much that since July of 2021, the number of short-term rentals in Vermont have almost doubled. There were about 6,500 4 years ago, and then June 2025, the number has increased to more than 11,500. So this is happening. More houses are going on the market at a time where this state is seeing an acute housing crisis, and people are desperate. People are worried about housing, about purchasing homes, young families, about renting homes. And so whether or not this will take care of the issue, that's part of the debate. The housing crisis is very complicated. There's a lot that goes into it. If you took these 6 or 11,000 short-term rentals off the market, that wouldn't take care of our housing crisis. But I think it's hard to argue that any time a rental unit is taken off the market, that contributes to our shortage. So it's really an interesting conversation, and I'm definitely looking forward to the show and hearing what people say.
Howard, one point you were just making about how complex this is echoed by a email writer named Robert, who just wrote to us to say it's easy to focus on short-term rentals. They're visible, they're growing, and they're a tempting political target. But is the real issue how existing housing is being used, or how little new housing is being built? Cities like Burlington are turning to short-term rental regulations as a solution. But if we're not grounding these policies in data or outcomes, are we really solving the housing problem, or just trying to show that we're doing something? Well, we're going to get into that debate a little bit more deeply in just a moment. We're also going to start taking your calls. You can call in at 800-639-2211 or email Vermont Edition at vermontpublic.org with your thoughts on short-term rentals in your community. Howard-Weiss Tisman has been reporting on short-term rentals and many other stories from the southern part of the state. Howard, thank you so much for joining us.
Excellent, Michaela. Thank you.
You can find his reporting on southern Vermont, including the stories we've been referencing today about Londonderry, on vermontpublic.org. Again, coming up, we're going to talk more about this debate over short-term rentals and how it's playing out across our region. And we'll take your calls in just a minute. Stay with us.
Thanks for listening to Vermont Edition, where support comes from Wendell's Furniture, home of wendellsdeals.com, offering furniture designed for a range of budgets, in stock and ready for summer. wendellsdeals.com. And Vermont Construction's Roofing Division, offering roof installation and repair with free estimates on asphalt and standing seam metal roofs. Now serving all of Vermont and northern New York. More at vtroofing.com.
Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Today on the show, we are discussing short-term rentals and some new efforts by towns to further regulate them. Joining me in the studio in Colchester is Julie Marks, the founder and executive director of the Vermont Short-Term Rental Alliance. Julie, it's good to have you on again.
Hi, Michaela. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. We're also joined by Nate Lantieri, the research coordinator at the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. Nate, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And we also have Londonderry's housing commissioner with us, Patty Eisenhauer. She's also a Wyndham and Windsor Housing Trust board member. Patty, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Well, right before the break, we got an email from a listener named Robert wondering what data we have about short-term rentals and how it is influencing these debates we're having over how to regulate them. So, Nate, let's start there with the data. How many short-term rentals are there in Vermont? Do we know?
Yeah. So Vermont Housing Finance Agency runs a website called housingdata.org, and that's really a public repository for all kinds of housing data that is available about Vermont's towns and counties. And one of the indicators that we have on there is metrics of the short-term rental market. So as of June, there are about 12,000 active full-unit short-term rentals. And that accounts for about 4% of the total housing stock. There's about 340,000 total homes in Vermont. So that, 12,000 full units. We consider the full units as opposed to the partial units because we kind of consider them as 1-to-1, this unit could immediately be used as a full year rental instead. So about 12,000 or 4% of the housing stock currently.
And do you have a sense of how that compares to other states? I know like Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont have historically had a very high number of seasonal homes, the highest in the nation.
Yeah. So that's kind of the point that I was going to go towards. So for as long as seasonal homes have been tracked, which is going back to about the 40s and 50s, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine have been the states with the highest proportion of their housing stock dedicated to seasonal homes. And so Vermont, that's around 14% of the housing stock, about 50,000. In terms of the short-term rentals, I don't have the comparison for the other states, but we can kind of generally assume that it's pretty similar. Our housing market's pretty similar to New Hampshire and Maine in a lot of ways. So many of the conditions we're seeing here, they're also experiencing as well.
And of course, the rates of short-term rentals vary widely depending on what town you're in. If you're in, say, a town with a ski resort right next door, or in Burlington, you might see a lot more short-term rentals than, a very small town in the Northeast Kingdom that isn't near a big ski resort. Julie, what are some of the hottest markets for short-term rentals? The place where you're hearing from a lot of landlords and renters.
Yeah, so definitely the highest concentration of short-term rentals we see in the state are around our ski resort towns. Not surprisingly, they are, as Nate mentioned, historically built up as second home communities. A lot of the condos were built by out-of-staters as their second homes. So we've seen a lot of the concentration of short-term rental activity around those seasonal tourist destinations for sure.
Yeah. And Patty, you have lived in Londonderry for 16 years, as I understand it. How have you seen the housing stock change over those years?
Yeah, well, Londonderry, being between Stratton, Bromley, and Magic Mountain, is an active recreational area, but it also serves as a community hub for the surrounding mountain towns. We have a bank, a market, hardware store, and most importantly, Floodbrook School is here, which 4 towns send their children to. So both my children have attended the local schools here. We do have, as others have said, we do have a high number of second homeowners here, and the average has been about 50-50 between full-time residents and second homes. But that number has been shifting a little bit over the last several years, and I want to say maybe about 60% of our housing stock is now second homes, and that does include increasingly short-term rentals.
60%, that sounds like a high number to me. That makes me raise my eyebrows. Nate, are there many other towns like that?
Yeah. So seasonal housing stock is definitely higher in some counties, like Lamoille County, Windham County. Actually, for all of Windham County, the seasonal homes make up 30% of the total housing stock. So when you get down to some of these smaller towns, where they actually don't have that many overall homes, it can really get up to, closer to like 50 or 60%.
Yeah.
So, the ones you would expect, Stowe, Killington, places like that, where, the number of overall homes really impacts that percentage.
Well, let's take some calls here. We have a number of folks calling in with their thoughts on the short-term rental market in our region. We'll start with Bob, who's in Rutland Town. Bob, go ahead.
Yes, your panel agrees with the problem, but if that's the case, why would anyone object to what the Vermont Supreme Court just recently allowed Burlington to continue with, which is requiring the owner and or the investor, because often the investors live out of state, to live right at the property? That's not onerous. That's not draconian. It sounds like Vermont common sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, for calling in. And yes, you're referring to regulations in Burlington where short-term rentals are allowed, but they have to be registered with the city and meet some very specific requirements. Julie, speaking on behalf of short-term rental owners, wondering if you could address Bob's concerns there.
Yeah, thank you. my understanding is that the case in Burlington is not yet been heard. The ruling from the Supreme Court was more of a jurisdictional ruling of which court is to hear the case that owners are bringing against the city. What we have seen is not a ton of ruling in Vermont yet from courts around owner occupancy requirements, but we have seen other court districts, federally and state, from around the country rule that owner occupancy requirements are unconstitutional as a breach of interstate commerce clauses. So while that challenge has not been brought forward in Vermont in our courts, we are seeing that ruling across the country.
Thank you for calling in with that question, Bob. We'll go next to Ben in Bradford. Ben, go ahead.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. I think that most of the short-term rental use should be town-by-town basis, whatever. But my bigger point is I would like to see less houses. I appreciate the idea that there should be more houses, but there's tons of big houses that are either empty or there's like one person living in it. You know, a lot of elderly people. We have a really aging population in the state. And I would like to see it be incentivized for these people to open up their homes in some form, either help convert it to rentals or help a young family move into that place. I think it would build community, and I think we need less houses, not more of them.
Okay, so Ben, what you're saying is instead of putting money towards development, building new houses and apartment buildings, we should focus our efforts on putting money into refurbishing and weatherizing Vermont's many big old farmhouses and trying to get more people in there. Patty, I know that Windham and Windsor counties, like many other counties in the state, have their fair share of this type of old housing stock. Is this a solution that you all have looked into, trying to figure out how to get these houses up to code and maybe get more people living in them?
Yeah, it's actually a relevant comment. The demographics in the state have really changed, and these large homes and the growing senior population. We're finding that big houses, not many people living in them, and the need, according to our housing needs study that we did conduct in Londonderry, is there is a great need for much smaller housing units, and these are ones for either just smaller families that are happening and or opportunities for seniors that want to downsize, that they can do so. But not all seniors do want to downsize either, and that's where home sharing comes in, and that's another tactic that we're taking a look at, and we're thrilled to hear that Home Share Vermont is coming into Windham County, and we hope that'll be an option for people.
Nate, is this an area that the Vermont Housing Finance Agency studies in any way?
Yeah. So starting with just that housing stock point, about 25% of the housing stock in Vermont is from pre-1939. So, and that's among the highest in the country of our portion that is that old. So, when we're considering these rehab situations, it definitely is one part of the equation towards, addressing the housing shortages that we have right now. And, going towards the point that Patty just made about the types of units that are available, where, yes, we want people who are, maybe a single individual or two individuals that are older that have lived in a community for their whole lives or much of their life to be able to make the choice of where they want to be able to live. If they want to continue to live in their home, maybe it's not suitable for them, and maybe they're not able to continue to maintain it. But they also need a type of home that would be available for them to find too, so that we can have that filtering. Someone is only able to move into a different home if there is one that's available. So for these homes to become available for a younger family, there also needs to be somewhere for the current inhabitants to live too. So it's not an either or; it's a both situation. Yeah.
Well, on that last note, we got an email from a listener who says that they think short-term rentals are negatively affecting the housing stock. They currently rent full-time with their family in a house that was previously an Airbnb. And when they were looking for a place, it was frustrating for them to see so many whole houses being used solely as Airbnbs. What about property tax relief incentives to property owners who rent to full-time residents as opposed to short-term rentals? So this writer brings up another way in which the state or towns could but really the state here could legislate to incentivize people to rent out their homes to full-time occupants. Julie, I imagine that you hear these types of concerns a lot. People who are really struggling to find a house or an apartment to live in year-round, and then they log on to Airbnb or VRBO, and they see a million places pop up that are way outside of their price range if they were to pay month to month. This is a broad question, but I'm just wondering, like, when you have these conversations with folks, when you're talking about your work and your personal life, what's that like doing your job in the midst of this housing crisis? Because I think a lot of people do point their fingers here at short-term rentals.
Yes, and I've had those fingers pointed at me personally. It is a difficult conversation, and there's certainly no denying that we are in a difficult housing situation in Vermont, and as is much of the country. But one thing that I really don't want us to lose sight of, and what I talk to towns about when I'm invited in to provide the data that we have and the recommendations that we can offer in terms of regulation, is that short-term rentals are a part of the housing matrix. They're a part of the diverse options that we want and we need in our communities. 80% of our short-term rentals also supply a very high demand type of housing, which is the furnished monthly housing. So, there are so many different situations that people require that type of housing. Nothing else is really in place in Vermont to provide that, and that accommodates traveling professionals. It accommodates people who are moving to Vermont, people who are testing out Vermont. I mean, short-term rentals are such a gateway for new residents to come see what it's like to live here and spend some time in an environment that's true to the Vermont lifestyle. So it's not an if or it's an and. We need all of these types of housing options.
Yeah. So to figure out how to make the scales balance or get all those pieces of the pie in there together, some towns are taking it upon themselves to regulate in a town-by-town way. I know the Short-Term Rental Alliance has pushed for maybe a statewide registry and not for these town-by-town choices to be made. Why is that?
I can't really speak to the political will of the legislature, but what concerns us is that we're seeing towns act without much evidence or analysis as to what the consequences of their proposed policies will be. The reason that we would much rather see a statewide registration program would be because that's the only way we could aggregate the data that's collected through that to truly understand and identify any areas that require further regulations. Right now, towns are reacting based on fear and emotion often, more than on evidence and data. And I think what we will start to see are some negative consequences of those actions.
Patty in Londonderry, what do you think of those comments? Were folks in Londonderry acting on fear?
I don't think so. Our short-term rental committee met for over a year, and we do benchmark with other towns, both in the state and nationally, and I recognize that we're not a first mover here, and so I recognize that a lot of other towns and other states have taken even more draconian measures in terms of short-term rental regulation. I think for us, it's really was about balance and slowing what we were viewing as an ongoing conversion of housing stock. into potentially full-time. Frankly, some of these are full-time lodging establishments. And we're seeing realtors market them for the potential short-term rental income that they can generate. And we view that as speculative in some ways. And so we're very concerned about that, especially for people that really want to call Londonderry home and live and work here.
Michaela, if I could respond, just to bring in the data, housingdata.org also reports on a town level short-term rentals, and what we've seen in Londonderry is essentially a flattening out of the number of short-term rentals in Londonderry since March of 2023. So this is where we are wondering, what is the true motivation and what is the true intended outcome of restrictive policies such as those?
Patty, do you think there's another motivation here, as Julie is saying?
No, I think our committee really did look at fairness across the board. There were no bans on short-term rentals. Grandfathered in existing short-term rentals that were here. I think it was really just to slow the conversion that we saw was happening. And as our housing study said, there are some concerns about the balance between year-round housing and seasonal buyers and short-term rentals. And the study did cite that it could threaten the viability and sustainability of Londonderry as a vibrant year-round community. So, concerns about that are still there. I recognize we're trying to implement lots of different tactics here rather than just focusing on short-term rentals.
Nate, I'd love to bring you back in here with the Vermont Housing Finance Association. What are your thoughts on this debate we're having here about whether short-term rentals should be regulated at a statewide level, perhaps have a registry, or if towns should be empowered to make these choices for themselves, considering the very different situations that each town is in, as you described earlier?
Yeah. I'd echo Julie in not thinking of trying to get too deeply into specific legislation.
Of course.
But I think that one of the immediate things that kind of comes to mind is some of the administrative hurdles of creating this registry, of actually needing to set up the state apparatus to actually collect this information from hosts on a really regular basis. So that's one thing that's immediately coming to mind, of like the administrative hurdle of actually doing that. But at the same time, it's able to take that more top level approach and say, what are we looking at in the whole system? Does something that is applicable in highly urban Burlington apply in the same way as something in much more rural, kind of tourist oriented Londonderry? So from a regulation standpoint, it really, the local conditions really do matter, because they are, while maybe not that overall different town to town in Vermont, that little local difference really can make a difference in what really the most effective policy should be.
Well, we just got an email from a listener named Eric, who wants to point this out. Eric writes, short-term rentals are not the cause of the housing shortage. Even the state agrees with that. The majority of the properties that are short-term rentals were never rental units and never will be. The main reason for the housing shortage is due to the state not investing in housing for more than 50 years. Land use regulations such as Act 250 and local zoning prevent new housing from being developed. Let's chew on Eric's point for a moment while we take a short break. We will keep having this conversation on short-term rentals and take more of your calls in just a minute on Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Today on the show, we are discussing short-term rentals and efforts by some towns to regulate them. Our guests are Patty Eisenhauer, the chair of the Housing Commission of Londonderry and a Wyndham and Windsor Housing Trust board member, Nate Lantieri, research coordinator at the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, and Julie Marks, the head of the Vermont Short-Term Rental Alliance. We got lots of folks calling in with their thoughts, so let's go right back to the phones here. Matthew is in Montreal. Matthew, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. So I'm a PhD candidate at the School of Urban Planning at McGill, so I study this issue peripherally, but I just want to mention about the data to encourage you guys when you're evaluating this to look at the number of, units owned by Airbnb owners, because a lot of times people say it's like a mom and pop operation. But actually, when you look at the numbers, might find that 15 to 30% are owned by people that own more than 10 units. And when they own more than 10 units, you can really see that it's a professional landlord operation, and it's not that kind of cozy feeling bed and breakfast that Airbnb wants you to think.
All right, I want to get all our guest thoughts here. Julie, we'll start with you. I saw you shaking your head.
Yeah, that is an important metric that we look at because it does it does matter and make a difference. So the data that we get is directly from Airbnb, our contacts at Airbnb, our contacts at Expedia, who owns Vrbo, as well as the big property managers who operate around the state, including Vacasa, Evolve, as well as our Vermont-based property management companies, which there are over 100 in the state. And all of them, all of their data together really tell us that no more than 1 in 10 short-term rentals are owned by people who don't use them personally for their own use. So if you're talking about a purely investor driven short-term rental market, it's about 10% is our best estimate. Otherwise, they are truly second homes or properties that are used by the owners themselves
For at least part of
the year. Yeah.
Okay, Nate, what are your thoughts here? This issue of ownership.
Yeah, it's something that we've really wanted to look into because it is, this in-state, out-of-state, in-town, out-of-town conversation has really bubbled up a lot of times. And unfortunately, the data that we have available is by host instead of homeowner. So, as Julie mentioned, management groups like Evolve or Vacasa, on our end, we can see that they manage hundreds of units, but they very likely own none of them. There are these management companies that are working on behalf of many owners, and from there, you kind of can't break it out. But, we know, though, that would say that many owners have 1 or 2 properties. What the actual breakdown is, that's a little trickier to find. But it's hard with the data available to really definitively say most of these are owned by larger owners.
Patty, when this issue is coming up in Londonderry, the issue of regulating short-term rentals, did ownership, who owns these short-term rentals, play into the conversation?
Well, for the first year of our ordinance, we did ask for property owners' names as well as if they were owned by an entity to understand, a little bit about, the underlying ownership available. There was, you can only go so far in terms of that. And that may be something that we want to collect more data on if we can. But sometimes it's a little bit more difficult.
Let's go next to Lynn in Wallingford. Lynn, go ahead.
Well, I'm just to let you know, I actually worked for Vacasa for over a year in southern Vermont, but that's just a side note. As a homeowner, I definitely, and I don't feel like anyone's really saying, I really feel like individual property rights are being infringed on here, and nobody sort of is saying much about that. If I've owned a property and I've taken care of it for however many years, now sort of towns are coming in and saying what I can do with my property. So I'm not a big fan of that. So I'm wondering where individual property rights come into this conversation.
Lynn, thank you for making that point. Julie, does that come up with the folks that you work with?
Absolutely. I mean, that's our bread and butter and the reason that we exist. And what we focus on the most for our members is watching for government overreach and protection of personal property rights. Absolutely. I mean, that's core to being a Vermonter. And I believe it's upwards of 70% of Vermonters are homeowners. And we want to see people's rights preserved. Absolutely.
And we did mention a Vermont Supreme Court case that's going on around Burlington right now and touches on how those rights are preserved.
Yeah, that case right now, I believe, is more focused on retroactive zoning and grandfathering. Excuse me. Yeah.
We have an email from Peter in Derby, who in part wants to echo Lynn's sentiment. Peter writes, my wife and I have a seasonal apartment in Derby that we rent through Airbnb. We get the nicest guests coming to town who eat at our restaurants and shop at our stores. The income that we make from this, we put back into the community in the form of purchases to support the Airbnb and paying cleaning staff. If we were prohibited from renting short-term, this apartment would not be made available to the general public, and it would not help with any kind of housing shortage. If there's an issue of housing shortage, that should be addressed appropriately, but I urge the state not to do any further regulation of short-term rentals. With what I think might be a very different point is Kate, who is in Barnard. Kate, go ahead.
Yes, I agree that a lot of people rely on short-term rentals to help pay their property taxes. But what has been bothering me and some of the people in town is that, especially during COVID, a lot of second home people, wealthy people from out of town have come and bought up just about every house available just to rent for short term. And possibly a solution could be a limit to how many days the owner has to live in it, or if the owner lives on the property, that could be a certain thing, then some wealthy or out-of-state person to just rent it out as a short-term rental. Mm-hmm. And that also cuts out for people who want to work at a restaurant, who don't have a lot of money and have no place to live. Mm. So that's my opinion.
Thank you,
and
Kate.
I think it should be town voted on and not state.
Okay, town by town and not statewide regulations. Nate, do you have thoughts there?
Yeah. So the timeline is definitely something that I think is really part of why this issue has really been under the magnifying glass the past few years. So from the numbers, we can see that the high point prior to the pandemic, which was in October 2019, was there were about 8.5 thousand active short-term rentals at the time. And now there's closer to 12,000. So, almost a 30% increase in that short time. So while overall it maybe isn't, thousands and thousands of units, it's that 3,000 about. In Vermont, where our housing stock is smaller, in some of these small towns where there's just not that many homes overall, it can be a really visible and obvious change. So, while it is only 4%, when we are in this really tough housing situation that's unfolded since the pandemic, it just puts that extra pressure on many of these smaller housing markets. So, both things are true, that it's not a huge volume, but every marginal home really does have an impact on the market.
Yeah, thank you. And Kate, I can hear that perhaps you're feeling a bit frustrated by seeing homes bought up by folks who don't live there year round. And Julie, I wonder how you would respond to that about a perception that a lot of these places, as we were talking about before, are being bought up by folks who don't live here and don't need housing as desperately as some Vermonters might.
Yeah, well, there's no question that Vermonters love their community, right? That's what makes Vermont Vermont. That's why people come here and spend time here and just are so envious of those of us who do live here. I think it's really important to point out that while short-term rentals, yes, they did have a banger of a year during the COVID. That is flattening out. That was kind of an anomaly, and we're starting to see that reflected. But short-term rentals, while they make up 3-4% of our housing, are almost 70% of our visitor capacity. And most of them exist in towns that don't have hotels. And what that means is over $1 billion in economic activity into our state through short-term rentals every single year. So we're not just talking about revenue for hosts and managers or the people they employ. We're talking about all the guest spending, the visitor spending that happens in our communities and is essential for keeping our local businesses in business so that residents can enjoy them. I know in my town, I don't know if my favorite brewery and the little coffee shop would be able to make it if they didn't have those visitor dollars. And so really, a lot of businesses, I think, do understand and see the need, that tourist capacity and the benefit of a short-term rental and partnering with those guests and with those hosts has really positive outcomes for the community.
Patty, what do you think about that? Are there in Londonderry, if there were fewer of these short-term rentals, would tourists, would visitors have hotels or other places to stay?
Yeah, so Londonderry, it's small. We only have 100 STRs, but they do represent 7% of our housing stock, so that's not insignificant. We do have Stratton and Magic and Bromley. Stratton has lots and lots of lodging establishments up there, but we are seeing, I guess, what you call a trickle-down effect, where people are looking for entire homes. I recognize that for family reunions and big groups like that. But we're also finding very much that the housing shortage, especially in workforce housing, is constraining the economy here and business vitality. We're seeing that local businesses are having to restrict certain hours and days of opening. And so I go back to this balance thing, and we have not built any net new housing units here in Londonderry within the last 5 years. So I think there's a period here where until we catch up and we have an opportunity to create some new housing, I think we need to monitor the balance very carefully. It's a catch-22. Yeah. I agree.
We have Tim calling in from Stowe. Tim, what are your thoughts on this conversation?
Yeah, I'd like to give a view from both sides of the fence. We did have an Airbnb. We rented out a room in the house that we had, and then we sold it, and we actually bought an inn down in Waitsfield. And once we bought the inn, it was kind of an eye-opener because of the amount of regulations that you have to follow, where you don't with Airbnb. So it's kind of unfair with Airbnb, and then someone who actually owns an inn, between health inspectors and fire inspections and the type of systems you have to install for fire alarms and water treatment systems. So there is a huge imbalance when it comes between the two when you're trying to own a business and trying to compete with people who have multiple Airbnbs that do not have to follow any regulations.
Tim, are you going to stay in the inn business?
We sold it a couple of years ago. It wasn't due to that, but there's just that part was just, it was really hard to swallow because the amount of hoops that we had to jump through just to have a 7-room inn compared to somebody may have a couple of houses where they're not regulated by the state or the town at all.
Well, Tim, thanks so much for sharing that. Julie, I'm wondering what your thoughts are there on that perceived imbalance between regulations of an inn or an Airbnb and an inn or a B&B and an Airbnb.
Yeah, so short-term rentals are regulated by the state. There's statute that was enacted in 2018. So the Division of Fire Safety, Department of Health, and Department of Taxes all have authority to regulate short-term rentals. The distinction when you fall out of the short-term rental definition and into the established lodging definition is when you have 3 or more units operating on a single property. So if you're thinking about that traditional inn, you have multiple parties that didn't come together, staying in a property where they don't have access to every single space. And or there's food service provided. Those do require different level of regulation and inspection. However, short-term rentals are a public building, and they are required to meet building code and fire code, just like any other rental. And occupancies of greater occupancy are also subject to even additional fire safety requirements.
And lastly, as we wrap up this conversation, Patty, I'm wondering if you could help us look ahead to the future in Londonderry. Now that these new ordinances are in place, the town has voted yes. What comes next? Will there be more changes or votes down the line? Will we wait to see how things settle out for now?
Well, when it comes to the short-term rental ordinance, our committee meets annually and reviews the data and, makes adjustments or recommendations to the select board as needed. Outside of STRs, the Housing Commission is looking at a lot of different options. And STRs, I would agree, is not the solution in terms of addressing the housing crisis. We're looking at supporting the use and creation of ADUs, conversion of large single-family homes to multifamily, and looking to we're, home sharing options, as well as potentially lease to locals types of programs. A lot of these things will require funding, though, and small rural communities do have a little bit of a challenge with regard to getting development done here because we don't have infrastructure like sewer and water, those sorts of things. So certain challenges with small communities, definitely, but we're working on creative ways to create more housing units.
Patty Eisenhauer is the chair of the Housing Commission of Londonderry and a board member of the Wyndham and Windsor Housing Trust. Patty, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
We're also joined by Nate Lantieri with the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. Nate, thank you for sharing your data with us today.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be here.
And Julie Marks is the head of the Vermont Short-Term Rental Alliance. Julie, thank you.
Thanks, Michaela.
And thanks to everybody who called in. If we didn't get to you, email us. Tell us what you want to talk about on this complex subject. Vermont Edition at vermontpublic.org. I'm sure we will be back to it soon. Our show today was directed by Mary Angish. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch up again soon.